we're going to talk about creation or evolution, looking at the evidence. So it's a very important issue, this, because many people build whole arguments on the fossil record. And what they try to do is to say that the fossils are evidence for evolution. Now, I'm going to have two stages to this talk, and then eventually it'll become sort of parallel points. There's two main points coming in this talk. Number one, I'm going to, for the sake of argument, assume their dating scale, even though I don't personally accept it. The second thing that I'm going to be talking about is the evidence of the fossils themselves actually shows to you that they weren't buried slowly. So there's two things that I'm actually going to be talking about. The first point then will be that really it doesn't add up, even if you do say that it's slowly over millions of years, and you'll see why in a moment. The second point is that actually when you look at the fossils really are saying to you, I was buried rather quickly, and I think you'll agree with me, most of you, by the time you've considered these fossils and what we're considering tonight. There's quite a lot, actually, which has been produced in recent weeks and months and years on the whole basis of catastrophe in the rocks, which is really what I'll be talking about. The fossils are evidence which requires some sort of explanation. People like to say that the issue today is science versus the Bible, but it's not. It's not science versus the Bible. It's actually science done from a biblical perspective, like on this side, or science done from a secular perspective, as on this side. So it's which way you're looking at the evidence which matters. It's what your paradigm is, your worldview is, looking at the evidence, which really is the issue. As I said on other talks, it's important to define your terms. The evolution position says that primitive forms have come to people by natural selection, and the creation model says that complex earlier kinds have always existed, dogs, cats, human beings. We've got to where we are with natural selection giving variety. Now, if you look at those two definitions, you will see that there are a couple of words which are in both, and those words are natural selection. Natural selection has an artificial equivalent. The artificial equivalent is when farmers breed different types of creatures. Or if we were talking on another talk, we were talking about dogs, and you get different types of dogs. Well, let's just stick with farmers and herds of cows. You could sometimes breed a particular cow to breed for milk, and so you get Jersey cows, and you get other types of milk-giving cows. But then there are also cows which you breed for beef, and that particular type of cow, say an Angus herd, would not be very good for milking. It's not that they don't have milk, but they're not bred for milk. You won't get a milk cow, a Jersey cow, from an Angus cow. You actually will have a big problem doing that. You've got to have the original grouping of creatures in order to breed to get that particular type that you would want. In other words, you lose information as you do the artificial breeding. It's the same with when you've got natural selection going on and you've got creatures out in the wild, maybe separated by location, separated by due to other phenomena which has actually caused populations to move from one place to another. They no longer interbreed, and therefore you tend to actually breed for a particular characteristic which is in that population. Now notice that we've got natural selection on the creation definition as well. The BBC and other well-known media organizations constantly present incorrectly that the creation position is against natural selection and against any idea of observed phenomena which do go on in nature. We accept that there is such a thing as natural selection. We know that that goes on. But natural selection is not what will produce a new creature entirely. Evolution, for instance, teaches that some reptile became a bird and teaches that wings would come where there weren't wings before. Natural selection will not produce wings. Natural selection will just alter and cause to adapt a creature to its environment. When I was coming to the meeting yesterday, I saw a red kite. Now, red kite is part of the kind of birds of prey. It may be related to other birds of prey like buzzards. There is a possibility. But essentially, it's a bird which is designed for speed and for preying on other birds, as is well known. And these birds will have always been essentially of that type. They will have been modified and adapted as the world has progressed, but they will essentially still have been kite-like in the original ancestral kind. Evolution says molecules became men. Creation says that created kinds were made in the beginning and that variation has taken place, as I've just been describing, but with no common descent. There's no common ancestor. Now, I'm going to look at a number of creatures. I'm going to look initially at the giraffe, and then I'm going to look at a number of others, and I'm going to look at modern ones, and then I'm going to look at the fossil ones, right? Now, the giraffe is an amazing creature because we all know it's got a great big long neck. How did it get a long neck? Well, there was for a while the view, which was put over by Lamarck and a few other people, who said that basically a horse was stretching to actually get to the higher branches for food and basically added in its offspring a longer neck. But of course, the evolutionists, to be fair to them, does not accept that Lamarckian view, which basically says that one phenomena was desired and it was passed on to an offspring which sensed that desire and so it carried on. No, that doesn't work, and that's not what they're saying. But actually, you haven't just got to have the ability to have a long neck for a giraffe. There is many other things which have to be right as well. And one of them in particular is that you need to have neck muscles actually within the neck to actually suppress the blood flow when the creature stoops in order to get water. Because otherwise it would just suffer a brain hemorrhage as soon as it stoops. Similarly, those blood vessels have to be freed again and the muscles relax such that the creature can not suffer a fainting fit as it lifts its head. But the other thing is that a giraffe has such a long neck that it needs a very special heart in order to pump the blood up to such a great height. So all these things have got to be right for the giraffe, and that is a design feature of this amazing beast. But my main point in this talk is that giraffe skulls are found, and they are clearly giraffes. They're a bit bigger. In fact, this particular fossil is a giant fossil of a giraffe. But it is clearly a giraffe, and that's the point. So if we were to look on the geological column, it is no different to a modern giraffe. And now I need to explain to you a little bit about this diagram. This is a diagram of the geological column. You can see on the left all the names. Don't worry too much about these names. These names are understood by the geologist and are attached to what they think are particular ages when these creatures lived. As the tertiary suggests, there should be a secondary and a primary, but then what's happened is that people have redefined some of the layers further down, and indeed there are many other layers right down here as well, which are not on the slide, which you will call the Archean and the Hadean parts of the geological column. But that which concerns us is that which begins to clearly have fossils in them. And the Cambrian, as the name suggests, is from Wales, and the Ordovician, the Silurian, is to do with an area in southern part of Poland and in that region, Silesia and all around there, where the layers have been given that name. Then the Carboniferous speaks for itself, full of carbon. The Devonian is linked to the name for where most of that rock is found in England, because William Smith, who was from England, did much of the early geology, and therefore he called the rocks found in the southwest Devonian, and we can find other places where Devonian rock is found. A bit higher than the Carboniferous is the Permian, the Triassic, and then the Jurassic rock, which some of you will have recognized from the name, is where, of course, it is reckoned that many of the dinosaurs lived, and that's called the Jurassic Age. You'll find Jurassic rock, quite a lot of it on the eastern side is visible in England. If you go to North Yorkshire, you'll find that some of the rock of the cliffs there is Jurassic, and you'll see a lot of the cliffs have fossils in them, which are typical for Jurassic type rock. Cretaceous is often full of calcium carbonate and full of chalk, particularly the famous chalk cliffs of Dover, but it's not just chalk, there's many other types of substance in the Cretaceous rock. And that is a very important boundary. We then lead to the tertiary rock, which is of all sorts of different kinds. And these years against the geological column are what is traditionally held to be the age of these rocks. The ages are connected with the radioactive dating, which I will come to a little bit later. We can question them, but I'm not questioning those just at this juncture. For the sake of this talk, I'm going to accept for the time being the millions of years, even though I personally don't think that they are correct. And we notice that against the millions of years, we actually have the progression of creatures. And we have the sea creatures here, the reptiles coming a bit later. Then we have the mammals, some of them coming up a little bit further on. And then finally we have men and primates at the top. Now, actually that's misleading, because many creatures are not always in the order that you would expect, and some of the layers are not in the order that you would expect. So the impression given by the evolutionists is that all these layers are all in their proper place, but they're not necessarily. Sometimes they are out of place. Sometimes they are missing, and we call such examples unconformities. And because they're meant to be millions of years between these layers, you would expect much wind and erosion to have actually caused an undulating landscape when you get such an unconformity. You get a line which you couldn't get a razor into, which indicates that actually there was no erosion going on, and that really what's happened is that one layer just simply didn't get buried at the time that these layers were laid down. So there is much in the rocks themselves which indicates a catastrophic origin. My point here is that even if you take the millions of years, even if you were to take that, the evidence is saying anyway that giraffes have remained the same. Let's look at something else, a feather. Now, feathers have an amazing structure which, when you look under a microscope, becomes visible. You have hooks sliding over ridges. The hooks come from barbules going in one direction, and the ridges come from barbules going in the other direction. The hooks and the ridges are coming from barbules, as I say, going in different directions, and the barbules come off the veins, or the barbs, of a feather. These are the barbs, and that which looks rather fuzzy in the middle is the barbules, which are gripping one another. Now, a feather is an amazing design, but the remarkable thing here is that when we come to the fossils, you can actually see a feather trapped in amber, which is hardened resin, amber which is supposedly 25 million years old, and yet the feather looks identical to a modern feather. You could break open the resin, the hardened resin, because that's all it is. It's just hardened, gooey stuff that's come out of a tree, and you could actually just simply break it open. You could pick out the feather. So here's a remarkable circumstance. And what about this? This is the feather of an Archaeopteryx, which is reckoned to be a halfway creature between a reptile and a bird, but clearly had fully formed feathers, because this is a very asymmetric feather, probably a secondary feather from the wing of an Archaeopteryx. A modern feather looks no different in principle. So we go back to our geological column. The amber is found about there in rocks supposedly 25 million years old, and yet the feather looks the same. Are you getting the message? So the first main message which was constantly coming across from these fossils is that feathers have remained the same. And all these creatures we'll find have remained the same. When you see them in the fossils, they look identical to a modern creature. Here's a monarch butterfly. It lays its eggs on milkweed, and it is an amazing creature which we could talk about its migration, which takes generations to come up from Mexico region to the different sides of America. But my point tonight is not so much to talk about the life cycle of the butterfly, but more to talk about the way it fossilizes. But before I come to the fossil, what do we know about the wings of butterflies? All of us know when we've seen them out in the open, or sometimes we may have occasionally had the chance to pick one up because it's got a little bit tired, hasn't got enough nectar, and you've actually perhaps held one. And you know you have to be very careful about touching those wings, because the wings are made of scales, and the scales will just disintegrate if you touch them. Well, remember that point, because now as we look at the fossil of a butterfly, notice that the wings are perfectly there in the fossil. How did they get there? Which brings us, of course, to the second point in my talk, which is, how do you get fossils anyway, particularly of something which would disintegrate if it were left there lying for a long while? It would just become brittle, and if a bit of mud or a bit of dust was gradually burying it, it would just become the very dust in which it was being buried. So how do you get that impression in the rock? There's only one way. Buried suddenly is what that fossil is saying. This is actually a fossil with a picture of which I took at Albany State Museum in New York State. And I had the privilege of actually seeing this fossil. I'd heard about it. It's a wonderful fossil of a butterfly. And it's clearly recognizable as a fossil. So which stresses the first point of this talk, which is that, you guessed, butterflies have remained the same. Well, let's move on. If you notice, we've come down a bit. We're now at supposedly 50 million years ago. But here is a damselfly in Eocene rock. But it's clearly a damselfly, and not by the way a dragonfly, which has a fatter body. But it's recognizable as such. Well, the very fact that it's recognizable should tell you something. Here, I'm just the same as you guys seeing modern ones. It's also telling me that because those wings are so wonderfully impressed into the rock, there is no way that that damselfly could have been buried slowly. So the damselfly is exactly the same in the fossil record. And the damselfly sits at roughly, in evolutionary terms, 50 million years ago. But it's recognizable as a modern damselfly. So damselflies have remained the same. But the point that we should remember is that not only are they the same, but you're burying here a very delicately winged creature. He's a wonderful creature. He's got 4 wings, and you can clearly see the pigment in the wings, which is brown. Remember that? Look at this. This is the fossil of a lacewing moth. You can't just see the impression of the wings and even the ridges on the wings, but please note, you can see the pigment in the wings. What is that telling you? I got buried quickly. That's what it's telling you. I didn't get buried slowly, because if I had been slow, those wings would have become brittle and just disintegrated. And that creature is now in rocks supposedly a lot older, 100 or so million years ago. And the answer is that lacewing moths have remained the same. Here is a dragonfly, which is sitting on a rope there. A dragonfly fossil, I will show you. Here's a dragonfly fossil. The dragonfly fossil in that picture has very clearly marked impressions in the rock. About a year ago, I happened to see towards the end of the summer a dragonfly which could have only just died. And when these creatures die, by the way, they do die with their wings open. Once they come out of the nymph stage, those wings never fold again. They always go around with their wings open. Okay, but this creature had evidently just died, and it just was lying there on the ground. So, because I'm fascinated by flying creatures, I picked up what was really the carcass of the dragonfly, but it looked very beautiful. And I put it on my shelf in the office, and gradually, you know what happened? It didn't go to dust, it stayed there, but it became brittle, and that's the point. Such that if I was to squash it now, it would just disintegrate into dust. So isn't that an important lesson that we're also seeing from these fossils? How are you going to get the impression of all these delicate structures? You can only do it by burying them quickly. Here's a modern meadowhawk dragonfly taken by my friend Robert Jensen in California, and he's got a wonderful picture there, each showing the transparent nature of the wings, which, although they are delicate, work wonderfully, and you can actually get dragonflies flying just about 20 miles an hour in modern dragonflies. But now I'm going to show you a fossil of a dragonfly. Here's one. This is a 320 million year old. I don't accept the dates, but this is what it's reckoned to be, a 320 million year old fossil from the Carboniferous period. And yet, it's recognizable as a modern dragonfly. Let's go back to this picture. The message that comes from these dragonfly fossils is that they're exactly the same as today, recognizable as a modern dragonfly. The life cycle of a dragonfly is fascinating, but my main point is this, that dragonflies, which are found here in this part of the fossil record, are exactly the same as modern dragonflies. So we'll move on. What about octopuses, or octopi, should we say? Octopuses are essentially soft-bodied creatures, although there is cartilage and other stuff which enables it to have some strength in its body, and in particular, of course, in the arms, where there are suckers. And in the arms, those suckers have actually been fossilized in this remarkable specimen from Cretaceous rock. So even the evolutionists who found this fossil were amazed that the arms, including the suckers, had been preserved in the rocks. So again, that's saying this sea creature must have been buried quickly in order to make such an impression. And of course, the main point is that the octopus is recognizable as an octopus and is no different to a modern octopus. So we move on to the king crab, which is fossilized here, and this is a modern king crab, sometimes called a horseshoe crab because of the shape. This is from Edinburgh Museum, and in the museum in Edinburgh there's a little plaque, and I shall blow up the words so that you can read them, and you can imagine the dour Scotsman who wrote this. with his masterful understatement as we read the words. Although some 150 million years separates it from its Jurassic ancestor, shown in this case, it is strikingly similar to that ancient form. That is a good example, as I say, of Scottish understatement. Horseshoe crabs, which are supposedly 150 million years or so ago old, are actually in the fossils identical to a modern horseshoe crab. There is no difference. Now, the coelacanth is an amazing fossil. That's what they had for many years, just that. They didn't have, until the 1930s, any examples of modern coelacanths. And so many people thought that the coelacanth was in the process of growing legs, and that it was going to eventually, after a long time, become a creature which was going to come onto land. Well, the coelacanth was found eventually in 1938 off the coast of Africa, alive and well. And before that, they'd found dead coelacanths, which the fishermen had brought in the fish market. And some Europeans said, well, how long have you been getting those? We said, we've been getting them for years. Well, why didn't we know? Well, you haven't come, have you? You know, basically, the fishermen already knew that there were coelacanths down there and had been getting them up off the coast of Madagascar. And now, of course, since then, people have actually filmed the coelacanth in the deep oceans off the coast of Madagascar. But interestingly, the coelacanth is fossilized in rock, which is supposedly of the order of 500 million years ago. Well, there's quite a few messages which come from this. Number one, the coelacanth has remained the same. Number two, what was happening then to all the other creatures while the coelacanth was just basically swimming around in the sea, minding its own business, and staying the same, thank you very much, and not wanting to change into something else. What does this really tell us? It really tells us that the coelacanth was an example, the evolutionists would say back to us, of stasis, that actually all the other creatures were changing. But how come the coelacanth wasn't changing is a very relevant question. So we've had a number of creatures, haven't we? We've looked at all these, and I could have looked at a whole host more. I've just given you one or two examples, more than that, about 10 examples there that I've been discussing. But we could have gone to case after case after case where the creatures are the same as today. In my hand, I have a fossilized fern. And it clearly is a fern, and there's no doubt that it is a fern. And it looks exactly like the modern ferns. Again, this fossil shows that really this must have happened quickly. Why? Because ferns, when they die, or shrivel up due to the heat, right, because it's been drought-like, basically when they die, they will just become dry and will not show their fronds anymore, and they will just disintegrate. They just become like sticks and just droop. So how are you going to get that fossil? The only way you can get it is to bury it quickly. That's what all these fossils are saying. I have a fish fossil here, a number of them. All these fish, you can actually see the fin marks in them. That really is again showing to us that these fish were buried quickly. So the message which is coming over from these fish fossils and the fern fossil is that these fish were buried quickly. The ferns were buried quickly. Let's then take on this argument head on, which says, but what about the creatures which are extinct, which we don't have today? Well, we'll look at two examples. One of them is clearly dinosaurs, but I will also look at another, which is trilobites. Trilobites were relatively small, but some of them actually could be quite large, which would be about the size of a man's hand. But the amazing thing about trilobites are that they were creatures which, yes, lived in the ocean. And these creatures are called trilobites because they are three-lobed. You can actually see the eyes quite well. In particular, this one, the eyes are standing proud. The trilobites are mainly from North Africa, and these trilobites, which are shown in the diagram, have exceptionally good eyes. But the eye of a trilobite, having a compound eye, is therefore similar to the eye of a fly, similar to the eye of a dragonfly, but therein is the end of the comparison. Because whereas each individual lens of a fly compound eye is made of protein, the eye of a trilobite, each individual lens of that eye, is not made of protein. So you can actually see the original material. And it's in supposedly 400 million year old rock that trilobites are found. The actual substance that forms the eye is called calcite, calcium carbonate. Now, I've got a lump of calcium carbonate here, but you can clearly see that there are two lines, whereas in fact the paper which is over it only has one line. So the calcium carbonate has the effect of splitting into two images. The complicated physics behind this would take quite a lesson to explain, but it's what we call birefringent material, where the light is actually splitting into two rays. One ray is at one polar angle, and the other ray is at a different polarization. So perhaps some of you who wear polarized sunglasses will know that it takes out some of the rays coming vertically, and it leaves you with the horizontally approaching rays. Well, what happens is that the horizontal approaching rays are bent at one angle, and the vertically polarized rays in calcium carbonate are bent at a different angle. So you get two images. That's why you get this effect. So if you to look at calcite normally, any writing will come out double. Well, the question is going to come to mind then, well, were the poor trilobites seeing double? The answer is no, for the following reason. You see, as I say, it's a polarization issue. If you actually were to put a polarized lens on top of that double image, you could actually spin the polarized lens round, and you could make it pick out one image and then the next. That's what's happening with the light going through calcite. Trilobites' lenses were lined up according to a particular direction, right? That direction, that line of sight, was lined up to a very special direction. Calcite forms a funny rhombus-type crystal, right? And the face of the crystal, if I have a line coming straight out from that face, which is the natural way to look through it, gives you a double image. But there is one particular line, and only one, and you've got to get it just in exactly the right position to get this. There's one line which is called the polar axis, such that those two images from the birefringent material would then become one. Guess which line each of the lenses, and sometimes there are thousands in the compound eye, guess which line the line of sight is lined up to in trilobite lenses. You probably guessed. So the amazing truth is that trilobites have their line of sight lined up to a very important axis, which is not obvious when you look at a natural crystal of calcium carbonate. There is yet another feature which I would just briefly mention, and that is that even if this lens were made of glass, there would be a problem due to separation into colours at the edge. Some of you sometimes have to wear glasses for long sight. You get very fat lenses and you get a colour aberration at the edge. The technical term is chromatic aberration. Well, it was found out by Descartes and also Huygens that in the 1700s they found out that you could change the shape of a glass lens to actually get rid of that effect. Now, trilobites have fat lenses, so they also could suffer from the same problem. So their lenses are shaped to take account of chromatic aberration. And the shapes that people have found when they put these little lenses and pushed the laser through them and measured their shapes are either the Descartes or the Huygens shapes. So Descartes and Huygens thought that they were making a unique discovery. But actually, trilobites had got there first and already had these wonderful shaped lenses. There are also other effects. There is a special substrate added in some of the trilobites, which also enhances the vision capabilities of these creatures. So conclusion, the optics of trilobites was very, very advanced. So are we correct in saying that trilobites were humble, simple creatures? Well, they may have been humble, but they certainly were not simple. They were actually very complicated creatures. Here are some examples of the hundreds, if not thousands, of individual lenses and the different types of trilobites that you find in the rocks, which are mainly Cambrian and Ordovician. And here's another close-up of the lenses of trilobites, and here the individual bits of calcite. Calcite is found, of course, in caves. It's found all over the Cretaceous type rock further up, as well as in Cambrian and Ordovician strata. And calcite can do that wonderfully. You can form stalactites and stalagmites in caves. That's fine. Calcite does that naturally with crystals like this, or this is water precipitated calcite. Here's the crystals. That's fine. Calcite can do that. And this is what we were looking at earlier when we were looking through it and seeing the double image. But what calcite cannot do is form these specially shaped lenses in trilobites. Well, I've talked about one example of an extinct creature which is no longer found. At least we think they're no longer found. Nobody's actually ever been to the deepest part of the ocean, which is in the Pacific and is of the order of about 7 miles deep. Nobody's yet gone right down to the ridge at the bottom. Maybe we wouldn't be surprised, would we, if we did eventually find some trilobites. But for the time being, the conclusion is that trilobites don't exist today. What about dinosaurs? Well, dinosaurs needn't necessarily be these ferocious beasts like a T-Rex shown in this animated graphic. Sometimes they come out quite small, but they are extinct creatures. We know that they existed. Nobody doubts that they existed. Nobody from the position that we take doubts that they existed. And again, the BBC tries to portray it that, somehow a creation thinker doesn't believe in dinosaurs. That's utter nonsense. Of course we believe in dinosaurs. The issue is, when did dinosaurs live? I get people when I'm speaking, sometimes at meetings, young people, particularly out in the open air, will come by as though they've answered the big question in life and that Christianity isn't relevant to them anymore. They'll say, what about the dinosaurs then? I say, well, what about them? Of course we accept that they existed. We have no doubt that dinosaurs existed. The issue is when they existed, which is what we're considering in these next few slides. Actually, we know that in England we can find dinosaur fossils. And some of you here come from the Isle of Wight, and you might have actually seen some of these fossils. This one's an iguanodon from the Isle of Wight. And the Jurassic coastline along the south of England, remember I mentioned there's a Jurassic coastline going up all the way to North Yorkshire, but there's a lovely Jurassic coastline which runs just by Lyme Regis and also to opposite the Isle of Wight and the Isle of Wight itself, which has some wonderful fossils in it. Here's another example of fossilization, but this time we're not in England, we're in Spain. Now, the reason I put this up is because in this particular dinosaur fossil site, 8 different dinosaurs are buried. But not just a few, thousands. Including, it says, several kinds of armor-clad plant-eating dinosaurs that were among the world's largest types of dinosaur. They have been identified among the 8,000 fossils which were found in this case in 2007. When you read the article, it also mentions, and I've added this here, in the article it also mentions that in the same massive burial site are found fossils of crocodiles and turtles. Now, why is that significant? Well, what did we say for the first part of the talk? We were looking at creatures which we do have today, all right? You've seen turtles. We don't get them in this country, but, you know, wonderful creatures which swim around and actually migrate. An amazing pathway across the South Atlantic, but that's another story. Crocodiles, I don't think I particularly want to get into the same river as a crocodile. We don't particularly like their smiles with their great big teeth bearing at you, but they are amazing creatures. But the amazing thing is, crocodiles are buried in similar layers, this is the point, as dinosaurs. Well, we do have crocodiles today, so there is an important message coming out of this. Because, okay, the dinosaurs we don't have today, so they've become extinct, so we say goodbye to them. It'd be great if they were found today, but as far as we know, they're not found today. But crocodiles, including this lovely ferocious beast here, we do have today. Now, interestingly, when we look at the fossils of them, some of them were gigantic beasts, much, much larger than we have today. I did dwell on it earlier, but the dragonflies that were shown in the earlier slides, they were actually having a wingspan of, could be up to 3 feet. Well, here you can see the crocodile, because it's a reptile, it just carries on growing, and if it's getting enough food, it just grows and grows and grows. And this one is probably the size of a double-decker bus. Indeed, one has been found in the Sahara, which is the size of a double-decker bus. Here's its mouth here, much bigger than a modern one. And so like the dragonflies, it seems that some of these reptiles got very, very large. Some people think that the reason that the dragonflies and insects were large, including, by the way, spiders, great big spiders have been found, is because basically these creatures were breathing oxygen from the air, and possibly there was a little bit more oxygen in the air in those days. Only a little bit, you only need a few percent more, and it can make quite a lot of difference, because it means that the creature can actually get its sustenance more easily, get the oxygen that it needs more easily. And with reptiles, it would be the fact that there's an abundant food supply, relatively warm waters, and they would multiply and grow and wouldn't suffer old age so quickly, because they would be able to grow and grow and grow before they became old and died. The main point here is, though, that crocodiles we do have today. Crocodiles have remained the same. But the point is that buried in the same similar layers as crocodiles are dinosaurs. So the message is, well, how come dinosaurs are supposedly evolving into something else, but the creatures in the same layers are not evolving? I think we need to get a handle on what the real data is saying. The real data is saying that these dinosaurs weren't evolving either. They were just simply becoming extinct. And we'll come to the reason for the extinction right at the end. But let me say something else about dinosaurs. Did you know that dinosaurs have been found in the marrow of the femur bone of a T-Rex with meat? It's still soft inside, such that you could have given it to a dog to gnaw on. Well, it may not have liked the outside because that was fossilized. But if it got at the marrow, it would have been quite content to have had it. And maybe you could have had a T-Rex steak. Because here is the meat inside the marrow of a T-Rex femur bone, this bone, broken open inside. You could actually see the stringy meat which you could have got your teeth into. Now, this meat is made of protein. It's certainly not made of calcium carbonate. We're dealing with protein here. Now, we could actually work out how long it takes for the meat to decay. You could actually work out the decay rate. And it's of the order of a half-life, that is, coming down to half its original value, half its original content of protein of about 400 or so years. It's of that order. So, certainly by 65 million years, you'd have lost all the meat. Everything is saying that it's not millions of years old. To get meat inside the casing, which is fossilized, of a T-Rex bone, to still have the meat intact, it's strongly saying to us, these fossils are not millions of years old. So we're now addressing the question, how old really are these fossils? I'm now going head on to those millions of years on that geological timescale. And I'm saying to you guys, we need to reconsider. Are we really right about how old these fossils are? You could even see the blood vessels in the meat, in the marrow of the T-Rex bone that was fossilized. Dinosaur bones. Interesting further fact. Some people have actually begun to look at the carbon-14 content of bones of dinosaurs. Now, you wouldn't normally do this because all the evolutionists are bound to say, well, no point in doing that, because if you know anything about radioactive dating, you have what's called the half-life, which I've already mentioned for the half-life of protein decaying. But if you've got carbon-14, it decays to nitrogen. It's an isotope of carbon. It's another type of carbon. Carbon is usually carbon-12. But when you've got carbon-14, it's radioactive, and it actually wants to change back into nitrogen, because nitrogen has the atomic weight of 14, which is what the isotope of carbon's got. It's got the atomic weight of nitrogen, but it's got neutrons there. Well, the neutrons then just lose their electrons, and they actually become, it changes its substance, it becomes nitrogen, because the element is defined by the number of protons that you've got in the atomic nucleus around which the electrons are rotating. So that's what happens with carbon-14. It gradually decays to nitrogen, which is indistinguishable from the nitrogen in the air. So the time taken to go from the original lot to half the original lot is roughly 5,700 years. The famous Libby was the finder of this effect in carbon-14, and he measured the radioactive decay rate. It's 5,760 years, if I remember rightly. Now, when you get a substance which is radioactive, then if you go to 2 half-lives, you're reducing to 1/4 of the original value. If you go to 3 half-lives, you're reducing to 1/8 of the original value. Carry on with me. 4 half-lives, 1/16. 5 half-lives, 1/32. Are you with me? What's going to happen as we keep going? It's going to be 1/64, then 1/128, then 1/256, then 1/512, and when you get to 10 half-lives, you are at 1/1024. Most people, therefore, would say that once you've got to 1/1000th odd of the original amount that you had, 10 half-lives, you've just about lost the lot. Right? So most would accept that 10 half-lives would mean that you just about 0. Now, what's 10 half-lives for carbon-14? Well, it's about 57,000 years. Perhaps we'll just add on one more, shall we? And go to 11 half-lives, and we'll say that it's about 60-odd thousand years. So, if you've got anything with carbon-14 in, you know that the maximum possible age that it could have, just from that reasoning, is about 60,000 years. Now, actually, the exact amount is going to depend on knowing how much you had per kilogram in the original sample. And you don't know that, because the amount of carbon-14 that a creature has when it dies is dependent on the amount of carbon dioxide which was in the air that it was breathing and was being absorbed into the body, right? You've got a certain amount of carbon-14 in you. Ooh, I didn't know that, but yes, you do. And the amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere today is governed by things like the water content of the atmosphere. So, generally, what people do is say, well, we'll assume that the atmosphere was similar to what it is today. Ah, you don't know that, but that's what they do. And they then reason that if you're going to carbon-14 datings, if you're going to use carbon-14 dating, then you will assume that the amount that you've got today in the atmosphere is similar to the amount when that creature died, and then we'll work out the amount that should be present after so many years, and that's how much we've got in the rock that we're looking at, so we'll extend it back and we'll work out how old this rock was on the basis that the assumption of what it had when it died was similar to what we have today. But of course you don't actually know that, and all the indications are that the water content of the atmosphere in the past may well have been different. And actually, there would be much less radiation getting through, which actually is what causes some of the molecules to become carbon-14 rather than carbon-12. It's the amount of cosmic radiation getting in. And if you've got a lot of water content in the atmosphere, less of them would have been radiating carbon-14. So there would have been much less in the past anyway. So all that is just simply saying that we don't know, just simply from the amount that we've got in the rock, how old it really is. But let's come back to the point that I was saying earlier about the maximum possible age. Even assuming that the amount that it had when it died was the same as when creatures die today, right? The amount of carbon-14 in the atmosphere being the same. We know that the maximum possible could be 65,000 years, or 60,000 years, which is much less than 65 million years for a dinosaur. This particular experiment done by these people has actually shown that there is a significant amount of carbon-14 in dinosaur bones. If they were millions of years old, there should be none. You certainly know that the maximum ages that you could possibly get, and they're listed here, are things like 25,000 years, 23,000, 30,000, and so on and so forth. Are you with me? So really, we are not at liberty from this evidence to say that these bones are millions of years old. Everything is telling us these bones are not millions of years old. Let me now just move on. I've just been talking, and I should have put this diagram up when I was speaking, about carbon-14 going to nitrogen-14. And we, of course, have been assuming a constant decay rate. I'm not particularly been questioning that, but what I have been questioning is how much carbon-14 was in the atmosphere to begin with. In other words, was that completely full, or was it half full, is really the issue. And if you actually say that there was much less carbon-14 in the atmosphere to begin with, then you get a much smaller age than the 25,000 and the 30,000 that I showed you earlier. Ages which would be consistent with what the Bible actually says, that the flood took place roughly 4,500 years ago. Now, let me just show you something else about dinosaurs. That was my carbon-14 bit, which is very interesting. Now let's come to another interesting fact about dinosaurs. Did you know that people have recorded seeing some large creatures? In Carlisle Cathedral, which is not a very big cathedral, but down the nave of the cathedral are graves, and one grave in particular is in the nave, and it's the grave of a bishop called Richard Bell. He died just before 1500, 22 years before it. So, okay, so he was buried there. You say, well, he must have been a great man. Well, he must have been, because they were drawing all sorts of creatures around his grave, including creatures, one of which looks distinctly like an apatosaurus with 4 hefty legs, a long tail and a long neck, and a face pointing the other direction. You say, well, they must have been imagining these. The trouble is, if you say that they're imagining them, how come they're drawing them with other creatures which are also around the grave, which I haven't put on the slide, which are recognizable as creatures today? Seems a bit odd. And it's not an isolated example. Way away from England, in Cambodia, in the middle of the country, there is a temple. We're not quite sure exactly when it was built. We know that it was earlier than the 14th, greater than the 8th century, so somewhere around a little over 1,000 years ago. There are all sorts of carvings in this temple, and one of them has the carving of what looks distinctly like a stegosaurus, because it's got great big plates going round its back, going along the back. Well, if you look on the website for this creature, people try to argue that this was actually some pig-like creature, and actually the leaves were just decoration. Well, I say, is that really a very good argument? Because if leaves were just decoration, how come we haven't got leaves going all the way around the creature? And everything really indicates that this was not done in the same style as these floral leaves going on the outside. These were done with points on, clearly showing, I would suggest, what we have found in the fossils of Stegosauri or Stegosauruses. You can actually see these fans coming out. It was a strange creature. Maybe it was used for heat dissipation. We're not quite sure why they had them, but we know that Stegosauruses were very distinct because of this set of blades which were coming out of its body. So what really do the rocks and the fossils say? What really are they saying? Well, I've been showing you fish fossils tonight. Let's have a look at particular examples of a fish and a dolphin-like fossil here. This fish is eating another fish. Did it die of eating too much and just quietly lie on the bottom of the ocean? And how do you get a fish fossil anyway? Because I've been showing you examples of fish fossils. Here's a lovely one. How do you get that fish fossil? Fish, usually when they die, what happens? Usually. It may occasionally be the reverse, but usually when fish die in your goldfish tank, what happens? They go up. They usually float. It is true if you get fish which have not got much air in them, it is possible that you could get them to go down to the bottom of the ocean. Even if that were the case, even before they got to the bottom, there's plenty of hungry creatures in the ocean which will grab a free lunch before the fish had even got to the bottom. And even the bones of fish get eaten by sea worms. This fish is in the middle of eating another fish. It did die of stomachache. I assure you that this is a snapshot in time as this creature suddenly got buried. Here's another one. Here's an ichthyosaur, not a fish. This is an ichthyosaur, something like a dolphin, because it's giving birth to a baby dolphin. Here it is coming out of mummy. Did it die on the operating table? Is that what happened? Was it having a cesarean and suddenly, everything went wrong? No. This dolphin-like creature was in the middle of giving birth and it got buried quickly. Everything is shouting catastrophe. Could you even see the scale marks of the skin on this ichthyosaur? An amazing example of catastrophic burial. Everything is telling you catastrophe. So the fish were busy enjoying themselves when suddenly there was a massive underwater landslide which buried the creatures, sadly, killed them, fossilized them, which is what we now find today. So what's it saying? Catastrophe. Just like we had earlier. That's catastrophe. What's the catastrophe? I have a book here which not just mentions, but dwells on a major waterborne catastrophe. So what's the evidence really telling us? This book is true. What would you expect if you ever had loads of water burying all sorts of creatures, both on the land and the sea? You'd expect lots of evidence of burial all over the world, which is exactly what you find. And here is a picture of earthquakes. The stronger colour is where there are major earthquakes. If you could just see in this picture, here is North America, here is South America, and here is Australia, here is New Zealand, here is Southeast Asia, here's Africa over here, and Europe over here. So this is what we call the Pacific Rim. This is, in the last 100 years, the earthquakes that have taken place. Our world is very geologically unstable, even today. Why is it still unstable? The reason is it's still settling down after a major disaster, which was of the order, biblical timescale, 4,500 years ago. People like to think that it's millions of years that the earth has been here. I assure you that isn't the case. The population graph for people says that we came out of Mesopotamia of the order of 4,000 to 5,000 years ago. The fossils are telling us that actually everything was buried in a catastrophe. The earthquakes still going on are telling us that the world is still unstable and that it was much more unstable in the past. There is a verse in the scriptures which says, the world that then was, being overflowed with water, perished. Was Peter correct or not? The answer must be, if we believe the Bible, he was correct. And the Lord, through Peter, was actually drawing a comparison between the flood and the second coming, because he talks about the same word that brought the flood being the word which will bring the end of all things. The Lord Jesus Christ said, as in the days of Noah, so shall it be when the Son of Man comes. The old world was entirely destroyed by water. That is the message, both of Genesis 6 to 9, and it's also the message of 2 Peter 3. It's the message of Luke 17, where the Lord refers to this major event. Now, if we look at everything through biblical reality glasses, the flood was a real event. The Bible records it in the historical part of the Bible, which is Genesis. But the ark was not like that. We laugh when we see drawings like that. But may I say it does a lot of damage to our children of Christian parents, if we give them the impression it was just a nice little story put there in Genesis, we don't give the impression of what the Bible really says, which is that it was a severe judgment by God. We need to get away from that. That is fiction and does damage to our spiritually to our children. Boats like that anyway wouldn't have survived the water of the flood, but the boats like this, or a barge of that size, would have been fine for survival even in very, very large storms. The ark was about 1.5 times the size of a 100-metre racetrack, approximately twice the length of a Boeing 747, 450 foot long, that is 150 metres long, 75 feet wide, or depending on what you take for the cubit, would be about 25 metres wide, 45 feet high, which is quite some size, which is like a 3-story building. That would be 15 meters tall. So not a small object at all. Many people think that the ark could have survived some very major storms in the Atlantic. And I'll just show you an example here. This is taken from a gentleman's research who is at www.worldwideflood.com, and he shows that actually if you increase the height of the waves such that they are even reaching heights of 25 meters, the ark would have survived. It might have been a bit more, seasick journey. You might have been wanting to go for your sick bag now and then, but you would have survived. These waves are much greater than the waves you would get in the worst Atlantic storms today. Much, much worse. And yet the ark was built for stability. It does depend where you put the centre of buoyancy and the centre of gravity, but obviously Noah wouldn't have put the heavy animals in the top. He would have put elephants and big creatures like that in the bottom. So we make some reasonable assumptions to get those simulations. Dinosaurs in Noah's Ark? Well, of course, if we've got the wrong type of ark, then you've got a problem with large creatures. And of course, that is fictional. We need to get the right biblical ark in our minds. Dinosaurs started off as eggs, embryos, and we found fossils of dinosaur eggs, embryos in the eggshell. So we know that they were reptiles. So they would have started off small, and a T-Rex might have been your pal for a year or so in Noah's family. But, says now it's time to get onto the ark, and it would be a small T-Rex, maybe a year old, maybe that size, which would have gone onto Noah's Ark. Young dinosaurs, I'm suggesting, went into the ark. The worldwide flood, though, then took place, and it was global. And I'm going to play you a clip to give you an idea as to what it might have been like when the flood took place. Nobody knows what caused the flood. Some people think that it was a splitting of the tectonic plates. And rather than gradual movement from the Atlantic ridge, forming America on one side and Europe on the other, and rather than the gradual movement of India squeezing against Asia, pushing up the Himalayas, which is still happening today, that it was actually much faster to begin with, and that the flood was the originator. Maybe it was a collision. Some people have suggested that. We don't know actually what precipitated the flood, but when the flood took place, that the continents, the Earth's crust split open, and fountains of water from underneath came up, as well as water possibly from a canopy, people have suggested, but I don't think that's absolutely necessary to think of today. Many people think that you don't need to have the idea of a canopy, because the water, if it's coming up from underground, would shoot up anyway and then come down again as the massive amounts of rain. And remember, you're not covering the world as it now is. You're covering the world that then was. The relatively high mountains that we have today, 5 miles high or thereabouts for Everest, 27,000 feet, it's a bit more. But that wouldn't have existed in the past. You'd have perhaps had mountains of about 1,000 or 2,000 feet, but nothing more. So the world that then was, if you now have all the water coming up, would cover everything. Let's now, as we close, look at this demonstration of what it might have been at the time of the flood. Terrifying prospect, but the safe place was in the ark. The world that then was perished. The old world was destroyed by water. But God says this present world is going to be destroyed by fire. The safe place is not in a literal ark now. It's in Christ. It's the cross of the Lord Jesus Christ. If we believe in him, we're safe against that judgment to come. And let me end by saying, as I quoted earlier, as it was in the days of Noah, this is the words of Christ himself, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man.